I'm Chris from Airwindows. Slightly late, it's 11:01. I said I was going to be here at 11. And I'm doing my live question and answer stream. After a epic fail on Sunday where I was not able to make a video for my plugins, but I did put out a plugin. So we're just going to wrestle with various things, and I'm going to do the best I can. So often I think we are stuck in that zone. I got no resources except for a bottle of water. Yay. And I will see what we can do. And everybody fled. There's no viewers. Yay. That's fine. Not like I deserve any viewers anyway. This is a great time for me to just fool with the mechanics and gear and stuff and see what I can make happen. I assume I'm streaming. I assume everything is working. It's always really difficult to tell when my whole rig is super unfunctional. Here, I got this set up in such a way where I can hopefully do this. Yeah, tilting the thing back a little bit. This is the camera angle I got scolded about before. People are like, what do you think? You're a glamour puss or something? It seems like I got audio. Yeah, everything seems to be working. Let me switch the chat over to live chat, just so as I don't miss anything. So yeah, here we are. I am pleased I was able to get a plugin out. That seems good. And Elohim is here. I keep looking at the screen to my side. Like I was talking about my rig being all screwed up. My rig is all screwed up, and so I can't count on anything working for me properly. Hi, David. David, fix the muzzle. So pretty much what we're going to do is just hang out for an hour and 40 minutes. That's right, 40 minutes, because somebody jumped on the Patreon in the usual response to, oh guys, you can bail off the Patreon now. As usual, somebody was like, I'm going to do the exact opposite and I'm going to show you. And threw so much money that we went to an hour and 40 minutes. So, yeah. I got nothing except me and news about interesting things that could be happening in the future. And I do have that. I've been having a conversation with somebody by email, not counting the various conversations I'm having to have just to make sure that I still have a place to live and all that kind of stuff. I'm having those conversations. They're going well. But I was having a conversation with somebody on email of quite a different nature, because this fellow was like, oh hey, I'm starting to make VCV rack versions of your plugins. Is this okay? And I told him, yeah, that's super okay. Do more. That sounds great. And basically they were like, oh yeah, well, what do you need from me? How should I do this? And I was like, I don't care how you do it. Just do it. Seems great. Oh, Infinity, I'm pleased to see you, because you will probably ask questions, hopefully ones that I can answer, or at least ones that I can reply to in some way. So yeah, a guy, I keep wanting to fool with these things. Forgive me while I mess with stuff a little bit more. There. I can do that, and I can see whether my stream failed. I've been learning what was happening with the live stream Minecraft streams that have been failing. The reason those have been failing is because I've been trying so hard to push a high bandwidth on it, but that internet connection also has to support the Minecraft server. And we've been running a mod that I actually wrote a fair amount of, which is, shall we say, abusable. So mostly my friend Shattered Song would be doing things that involved blowing stuff up much, or just making really large quantities of things happening. So he'd be firing off these snowballs that constantly started cajillions of server communications between his client and the server, all while I was streaming. And it would eat so much bandwidth that the connection would die pretty much no matter what it was. Like, I ran in 6K, and which I'm doing now, and it would crash. And then I would run on 3K, and it was better, but it would still crash. So what we're going to do is start doing a different mod. One that is actually fairly hard on the server, too. It builds these underground terrains, and I made a whole thing where I was doing that. And our regular fooling around and talking with each other is going to be more along the lines of just hanging out and not doing these incredibly radical things all the time. And that ought to fix the problem, because it would normally work. It's just that as soon as one of these crazy server smashing things started happening, it would all blow up. And that was no fun, and some of the mayhem that they got into at my expense was no fun, so we're going to not do that. But yeah, I have a guy who has linked me to his private, I might add, GitHub account, and he's like, oh, I'm trying to do Airwindows plugins in VCV. Is that okay with you? And I was like, yes, it is indeed okay with me. What I would like is for you to show me a working copy of this stuff so that if I wanted to do it as well, I would know how. And his response was like, I'm not making it public. This doesn't compel him to make it open source. I'm not doing like GPL or something. But I'll show you what I did. And he showed me what I did. It looked like that stuff worked. And I grabbed a zip file of everything that he had. So it looks like I'll be able to do my own version going forward. It's just that we're not necessarily going to be doing the same plugins, because there is absolutely no chance that I'm going to be able to drop everything and port all the plugins to VCV Rack like overnight. That's years of work. So best I can hope for is to start experimenting with some of this stuff, start making things, and it would also involve like fooling around with some GUI stuff that I'm no longer, like, everything is up in the air at the moment. Not in terms of me releasing plugins, I'm going to still do that, but a lot of things are super up in the air in a disconcerting and distressing way. By the way, I should grab some questions as we go by. Infinity already has a question. FGX has dither on output. Does that help with preserving the quality of plugin processing, or is it just dither on the end? That's going to be just dither on the end. Fab filter, same thing. I believe Isotope stuff is using a fancy high energy dither, which you may or may not like, but it is a high performance one. And yeah, these are all things we can do. And yep, dither on output is typically going to be for going to CDs or maybe 24-bit if they're really clever. So yeah, the VCV stuff is interesting, and it's looking like I need to experiment with that more, because it's been I've had a lot going on and a lot to think about. It's been some time, and I don't think I can do things in VCV that are comparable to what I can do with my music, and I like analog things. But people can download VCV. And that alone is enough of a reason for me to try to support it in some way. Maybe that'll be the new thing, because it's like I've been getting into Reaper, but I never really got into showing the interface of it. I don't really know what to do with it. And if it gets into like capturing stuff on multi-track and being able to show these actual mixes and things, I am still lost in Reaper. So I think what might very well happen is I kind of dove back into the Apple things. Namely, here, let me fool with this a little bit more. I dove back into Apple things a little bit because there were some things I needed to do that I was going to need to get like Final Cut, because I owned ScreenFlow for years and then it stopped working on my current machine, and I went, okay, screw it, I'm going to have to get like the house editing thing, which means if I can get a better computer at some point, all of its little bits are going to be well supported by Final Cut, because Final Cut is also by Apple. So they're going to build that stuff in. And much like with Logic, I find that kind of more approachable in some ways. It's like, I like the way some of that stuff works, and with some things, I need to be working with tools that I understand and get along with. So I think it's fairly likely that I'm going to be switching back to Logic, and I just tolerated the fact that it wanted to load gigabytes upon gigabytes of garbage onto my computer. I consider the Apple Loops garbage. It does not speak to what I want to do with the digital audio workstation, or modular synthesizer for that matter. It's like nothing about what I like is represented by that choice of theirs to be like, here's our giant libraries, construct sound out of these handy Apple loops and build these things, and all of this stuff is just garbage. And I don't think it's good for people to be doing that, and I don't want to do it myself. But they won't let me not load all of that stuff onto the computer. And I just got one with enough hard drive space that it's like, okay, I can survive having piles of garbage on my computer. But the thing about it is, I know how that program works. I'm familiar enough with it that there are some things that I could do that would actually work, and that's the hope anyway. Because at some point I have to start tracking stuff into the computer. I can start it off with the modular. I can start it off with like beats and rhythms and things, but I'm needing to make more samples. My drum kit is better than I've ever had it before, partly because of no thing about the drum kit itself. One of the things that I did recently was I took a large piece of plywood and put it on the floor on a support of a bunch of bricks. And then I set up the drum kit on top of that and screwed all the parts of the drum kit into the plywood, so that no matter how hard I play, and sometimes I play pretty hard, it won't be falling over, or stuff won't be skating around or moving away from me, all that sort of thing. And that is quite a relief. Still playing with my controls, don't mind me. But the other side of doing that with the drum kit means that it's now the same trick that was done on a number of, I think, Tom Petty's Damn the Torpedoes and Led Zeppelin 2, if I'm not mistaken. I could be mistaken. There were a number of albums where the engineers built a little riser or built a little stage for the drums, because the idea was they don't really sound right unless they're resonating on a hollow wooden thing. And I think that's pretty cool. The idea of doing that is pretty cool. And I've not recorded that rig once I set it up once. I feel like I should. I feel like you can actually see behind me, months ago, and I have yet to really play this in a serious way, and I never recorded this once either. But I got the Rickenbacker that I'm excited about, except for that I keep not using it. People are like, play a bass solo. I don't want to, that's not what bassers are for. That's not what I had in mind. But I wanted to be doing something like prog. And now I have all of this stuff set up and haven't been using any of them because I'm working on the plugins and all these other things so hard. But in time, I will get that together. And I think one of the things to make that happen will be returning to Logic, because I know how to use Logic. I'm familiar enough with it that it'll be easier to get rolling on things. And then a lot of stuff can happen, like my making kits of plugins for giving a smaller selection of Airwindows plugins and then showing people how to use them. That can't happen with music that's done entirely mixed analog out of the box. That can only happen once I'm actually working and doing mixing and stuff in the box, or at least being set up to do it. I have to at least have the tracks ready. And various people are like, oh, you should do rock. And I'm like, oh, I never do rock because I'm not very good at it. And people are like, no, you're wrong. You are good at it, because I heard some of the rock that you did and I liked it. And I don't really know what to say about that. It's like they're contradicting the inside of my brain because the inside of my brain is wrong. And that's challenging. That's super challenging. But it's also part of the process by which I'll end up making these tools and collections of plugs and things like that where people will be able to have them. So I got to get myself through some of these things to the point where I'm like doing a song or even just a dumb jam that's multi-tracked in the computer the whole way I set up. Oh, Elohim, the thing about that is I'm already doing ambient. You've said that over and over again, and I started doing it on Wednesdays. And I'm kind of liking it. To me, ambient is my modular stuff, but without beat, or at least without drums. It can have a tempo. In fact, it's hard to do stuff that doesn't have a tempo. But the gist of it, it's not that hard to do stuff that doesn't have a tempo, because I can set my stuff up to work without tempo. But the thing about that is the way I'm doing it, that's still all out of the box. That's in some cases it's all analog. In other cases it's like stuff like my chord organs and things that have digital aspects to them, but they're being mixed and equalized and filtered and stuff in analog. And so the making music and being able to demonstrate doing it in the box is not something that works for ambient for me. I also am skeptical that people are particularly interested in learning how to do that, or that I could do a demonstration where it's like, oh, here, I'm Chris from Airwindows, and this is me setting up a mix in the box, which is ambient. It would be like, thank you, I guess. Okay. Why does that be there? Because that's the noise that be there. Why is there reverb? Because everything has reverb in ambient. Well, it can. It doesn't have to, but everything can have lots of reverb in space ambient, especially. And the tutorial aspects of that seem to be kind of lacking. That said, I'm going to continue doing it. It is one of the genres that I actually listen to when listening to music, so I'm most definitely going to be doing that. But tutorials, put it this way, get a pile of people together to ask me to do tutorials on how to do ambient, and maybe you'll see something like that, because it's like, I ain't buying the... So I'll make music for you if it's also music that I like. Doing entire tutorials showing people how to do something for one person, that I'd start to need to target a larger window. But that was a very casual suggestion anywho, so. Elohim says that there's a new Logic version. Okay. I have an older Logic version, but it's not super old. And I'm sure that'll be fine. When I don't automatically go to the newest versions of everything, although sometimes, like with like VCV Rack, I'm hoping that continues to grow in a way that makes it really progress, because I felt like I found it very limiting and I couldn't figure out how to use it properly, and I felt like I was going to run out of computer before I was doing anything non-trivial. I do know stuff that I can do. I can work creatively in there, but that I would be interested in watching, it progress. Something like Blender. I've been looking into current programs for a bunch of things, because among other things, I decided that I wanted to get a monitor tablet just in case the world ended and then you couldn't get anything anymore. It's like, okay, getting one of those, and in case the banks all go away and I have nothing but the stuff that I have, it's like, okay, tablet. And that led me to graphics programs, and I fooled with a number of them and found that I had opinions about it, although I still haven't been doing much arting because I've been having other stuff going on. I'm a fan of Affinity Photo for certain things, and that's what I would be using for Ermagerd. I completely forgot to fool with the, well, no matter, I don't care. The lookup table stuff that I was doing. The thing about lookup table stuff is that you can take video, including with the free OBS, run that, and then start doing crazy things with your visuals, like solarizing and inverting and really wacky stuff. And Affinity Photo is quite good at being able to do that, because you can take an image, including what I'm doing is a picture of like this from off of the stream, and then there's a little graphic that you put in, which is the actual lookup table, and the default one is the one that is not changed. So what you do is you embed that in your image. You just paste it on and flatten it, maybe make a little space around it so you can select it easier afterwards. And then what you do is you mangle the picture with whatever color correction tools. Only thing you can't have is you can't do anything animated, but you can do weird things with color correction tools, and the more abstract you get, the more interesting the results will be. I've already seen, like I do my sort of faintly orange, faintly blue kind of thing, and I did another one where I hyped up the colors of stuff, which is what you're seeing now actually, is the one where it's hyping up the colors of things as long as they don't get too bright, and also color correcting in such a way that I have this little watercolor palette that I made, and I tried to make all of those colors come across on the video as close as I could get them to being exact. I think that's useful. I think that's handy. But you can get much weirder than that, believe me. And I'm looking forward to demonstrating that. But Affinity Photo is very useful for manipulating the colors and things that way. Yeah. Folks in the chat are having a fun conversation about compression. Right on. I also discovered another free program called Krita, which is like a painting program, and didn't get along with it. Like, I'm familiar with Photoshop, and part of what Affinity does is it tries to bring things into the zone where some of your muscle memory with Photoshop will still apply. Krita is very pretty and does very fancy things with weird brushes and such, but it seems cumbersome. Like, the way of doing things is awkward and requires too many operations. And I was not able to like hold Option or something and grab a color off of the screen. And that is a huge problem for pretty much anybody working creatively. Like, I'm going to end up needing to do like matte paintings, background paintings for animation stuff I want to get into. And if you're doing that, you must be able to just push a button and click and grab a color off the screen and immediately be painting with that. It's not even optional. It's like a large part of your workflow is going to be like that, and it's useless to need to go to some color picker and like set the hue and then maybe have the little triangle to select from and stuff like that. Painting in a more intuitive way requires that stuff is actually there on the screen, and then you go forward through that. So Critica fell down on that for me. I think I had tried it and then got rid of it and was like, wait a minute, what about that thing? And I downloaded it again. I tried it. It was even prettier and fancier, and it still wasn't doing some of the things that I needed. David, I've got a clipper called Clip Only, which is pretty good. It's basic and does that. 80 Clip has too many things in it that are not actually helpful. Too many like FGX derived things in it that are not actually helpful. So that is no longer a recommended move, although people can still have it. I don't believe there's anything that reasonably adjusts space in it, but if you're slamming things, there's a thing that can adjust sort of fake base. And I also recently got in a conversation, speaking of like Krita and stuff like that, where somebody brought up Clip Studio Paint. And the thing about Clip Studio is, maybe you're thinking about One Corner Clip. Got lots of clippers. The thing about Clip Studio is that it's relatively cheap, certainly compared to something like Adobe. Adobe is not worthy of being taken seriously anymore because they've just gone so far downhill. And if you're doing certain things graphically or visually, Clip Studio Paint is like straight up unbeatable. It has so much going on, and it does let you grab stuff off of the canvas like I needed, but there's a lot more going on where, like, if you were a cartoonist, then there is entire elaborate systems for making panels and panel borders and setting up these little canvas areas where if you define a panel, boop, and then you click on that and you're drawing on a special window inside the panel that is any size you want, but is bounded by the panel borders, so you can scribble within it or draw things and going across the panel borders, and then move the panel borders aside to reveal more of what you had been drawing. It's bonkers. It's bonkers how much is going on there. And they've also got all kinds of weird brushes and things. And the rulers and drawing guides that this program has are also completely bonkers. And it's just stuff. It's like interesting stuff to do, stuff to get interested in. And that's kind of how I feel about VCV Rack. Like, I've not yet gotten into it to the point where, first of all, where I have any facility with it and know what I'm doing. But secondly, I'm not sure if it's falling into place for me that well. And the hope is that if I can start, like, part of my complaint is I can't get this to sound the way that I want. I'm used to working with analog gear and being very fussy about that. Well, what if I brought in a bunch of Airwindows plugins and picked out ones that would be useful? Like, if I was doing VCV but was running a submixer that was a console mixer, and then I could at least layer stuff and other things, like there's probably a bunch of interesting things that I could do based on the stuff I've been learning in the modular world that could be translated to this. So if that got good enough, I could see having that be like product releases in their own right. I have to start doing it, and I have a zip file on my desktop, which is a guy porting my stuff over to VCV versions and making his own graphics and figuring out all that stuff so I don't have to, and then letting me have it back. That's what I've been waiting for, and it has happened. So it's time to see what arises out of this. I'm going to have to wait for some time where like my stomach can stand drinking really large quantities of coffee or whatever it is I'm going to need to do. That's about as far as I'm willing to go as far as abusing myself in order to get stuff done. But I have the code now to do stuff like that. Technically, VCV Rack could send out MIDI, or my rig does not run on MIDI. Technically, it's timing itself through MIDI, like the Zox boxes will feed MIDI clock, and the Erica Synths drum sequencer can take in MIDI clock, so I'm capable of running those, but half the time I don't even do that. And VCV Rack may be able to send CV based upon whether my converter is able to send DC, but that's not really... It's going to be more useful to keep the things kind of separate, because the way like my analog rig works with me making music and finally getting some stuff recorded multi-track so that I could mix it in the box and be able to put together some of these kits for doing this stuff. That's a whole separate thing and doesn't require the PC, the Mac, to be controlling it. Rather, it would be either generating the chord sequences that I generate off of the synth, or using, I think it's a noise engineering thing where you can make these brief little, like 4-step, 8-step, however many step sequences on 4 CVs at once. And you get to randomize them, but you also get to dial them in, which means that I could make a 4-chord song and then just sort of build the chords in by kind of dialing them in and going like, okay, that'll work. Let's start playing that, run it into the computer, and then I've got a bunch of stuff, including drums and chords and things, or at least guide drums, because if it's in the computer, I can track over it, and I can track real drums over it, and that's when things start getting really interesting. But that doesn't relate to VCV Rack. My picture of VCV Rack is much more along the lines of, this is more of what I do to help people have the free tools and be able to do something creative. It doesn't have to be something where I feel like, wow, this is great, I'm going to use this for all of my own music now. And that limits it because it means I won't be working with it as much. But to the extent that I can do that stuff and come up with things that have their own merits, that means being able to bring like my vision for how I think music and instruments should be into somebody else's open source vision, so that everybody can have that stuff, including people who can't have the hardware. I mean, that's a criticism that I really feel. And even just yesterday, I released a bunch of drum samples, and along the lines of what I've been hoping and wanting to do, which is I assemble all of this stuff. I assemble this like hardware and the mixing boards and things. There are times when I'd like to be able to mix for people, and I've done that once. My problem is that I'm only comfortable doing that if it can be an attended session, and that's not sensible right now. So I kind of have to bail on that, or come up with a way of doing like a live stream so that a person can listen to a really crappy version of it over the internet while I do it, and that could be like an attended session. But I can also take this stuff that I'm building, like in the analog world, and which shapes how I do plugins. And when I can record stuff through that, like the snares that I compressed through all of that rig, and then capture it at like sufficiently high level, and then put that out there, that's a way of me being able to bring that stuff to people, where it's not just like, oh, look at me in my fancy rig. It's like, hey, you want some snare samples? I just made some snare samples for you with my fancy rig. Here you go. And that's what I did with the Beyond snares. And it seems to be going over fairly well. People seem to be pretty happy with it. I hope to do more. Again, I feel like I want to review some of the stuff I've been picking out, especially when it's things that are not all that well known about. Like, I don't see a lot of people talking about Blue Lantern. I think that's crazy. Blue Lantern can sound amazing, especially for electro. But I don't see a lot of people talking about it. He's just, he sells stuff, this guy, and he's talked certain places like Perfect Circuit into carrying a bunch of his things. But I'm not sure, it's not quite like Moog level as far as popularity is concerned. And it's way cheaper than Moog level. And I just think it's sort of great stuff. But the thing is, I recently had a neat idea. Elohim is going like, let's build some DIY mini synths. I don't really... Matchbox? I don't know what that is. Here's the thing. I hit upon an idea that I really liked. You know how I had the... this is like from live streams a year ago, ages ago. I had a briefcase, and I was going, I'm going to make a secret briefcase, and that's going to be the modular synth craziness for like DIY stuff. I'll figure out how to build things out of the chips, and I'll get lots of these chips, and then I can sell the chips on to people, which that idea kind of fizzled a little bit. But a quick question. David Robertson in the KISS list. Is there a brick wall? Nope. There is no Airwindows brick wall limiter plugin that allows you to set an exact output ceiling, especially if you're thinking in terms of post-reconstruction high-frequency spikes. Those are very tough to do. So no, there is no Airwindows brick wall limiter. There are clippers like one corner clip and stuff like that, but there is no Airwindows brick wall limiter. But yeah, so I had this briefcase I was showing people, and it's like, I'm going to make a synthesizer out of chips based on this briefcase. And I came up with a lot of stuff that would go in the right direction. Like, there's a chip that can do a sort of sequential thing. You feed a oscillator to it, and you can get a lower rate thing. You can feed triggers to it and have it be sequences. And I got a bunch of switches, and that kind of stuff is a little bit more difficult, but I got a bunch of switches where you'd be able to switch the switches around and set up different drum patterns. And I got a cajillion tiny LEDs for very cheaply from All Electronics. And still have all these things, haven't done anything with them, but then I hit upon something that was a very neat idea. See, I have a whole bunch of perf board. The perf board is what I've built some of my stuff on. In fact, you've seen some of these things. The Instagram, which I never post to, is where I put like these hardware experiments. And I've shown some of these things built out of perf board on there. I also got like mahogany and was experimenting with building stuff with a fancy furniture looking faceplate, which is difficult because then you can't actually get the jack through it because it's too thick, or if you can put the jack on it and put the nut on the end of the jack, then the mahogany is so thin that it'll just snap instantly. But I ended up making a very large collection of perf board that is already cut to Eurorack size. It's like X many, it's odd number unfortunately, but it's X many HP wide and it's exactly the right height. And I didn't get any further. It was the kind of thing where it's like, and I have to make drill holes in it. You drill holes in the edges at exactly the right places, and then you can put the screws in, you can build it into that. And then it struck me, I already know one thing that you can do with this perf board stuff, which is you can take the perf board and a simple thumbtack and poke it through the holes in the perf board and stick it to something. Which means if you're going to build a DIY synth without a case, what you'd need is like little thin strips of wood or even cardboard or something like that, or corkboard, whatever. And if you had the right sizes for the perf board for building stuff out of, and then you had like your secret briefcase and you took simple blocks of wood, simple strips of wood, the way that they put rack rails. The rack rails are expensive, like for 6 foot or so, it's like $75. You can get rack rails, but to build a Eurorack case is an enormous pain in the ass. And I haven't really been wanting to do that. But it's relatively easy to get this perf board for DIY experimenting. And if you can get that and you can score it with like a knife or scissors or something like that, it's relatively easy to snap it to the sizes that you want. So you can make these Eurorack sizes. It lines up along some of the lines of holes where you can make Eurorack sizes for these things. And sometimes your spare pieces of perf board are also useful sizes. And you can put electronic parts in them, and you can put the chips on them. And you can often get things like when I was building the Music Thing modular stuff, what I ended up doing was building them without using the IC sockets that came with it, because I was like, I just want to wire these chips directly in. I'm going to do it perfectly. I didn't do it perfectly. One of them had a single problem with it, but most of them were perfectly. And I don't want it going through the extra connection. I want to solder directly to these chips because my skills at soldering are so good. Turned out like reasonably good. And that meant I had some of these IC sockets left over. And it just so happens that Tom Whitwell from Music Thing Modular picks out really good IC sockets. They're the same kind of IC socket that I had gotten a large number of just these little pin jacks that you can put those Bastel style connect board, like experimenter board pins into. So basically what I'm seeing is if you choose rightly, it's possible to start building synthesizers out of almost just the chips, but also the perf board, which can be gotten in large quantities, and some kind of enclosure like a briefcase or something like that, thumbtacks to hold the perf board on. And you wouldn't really be wanting to change it around too much, but it should hold. And then for making interconnections, you're either soldering stuff together or you're soldering things coming out of the chips to IC sockets without ICs in them, which you can then plug these little wires, much like Bastel does with theirs, into the IC sockets because they're well done. They're good sockets and can be plugged and unplugged as long as you're using exactly the right size for them. And this is skipping having to get Eurorack rails. This is skipping having to get real cases and enclosures. This is skipping having to get jacks. So much gets skipped that it feels to me that it becomes a possibility for doing the DIY synthesis based off of chips in a much more approachable way. Like, it should be possible to get into this kind of stuff for easily under $100. And if you're doing something non-trivial and needed to make everything like connect using Eurorack cables, then your cables are already going to be a huge chunk of your money, and then the jacks themselves cost an arm and a leg. And it all starts becoming like the modular scene, which is, yeah, you'd better have some money put aside to be able to do this, and that's not what I wanted out of it. But building this in the sort of secret briefcase style, where you're hooking things together with these little tiny jumper cables. Granted, you have to wear glasses to do it, or have really brilliant eyesight to do it. But doing it with those little tiny jumper cables means leaving out so many expensive parts, And the voltages and the signals and the waveforms are the same. So, I don't know, that's exciting. The only thing the only thing that is comparably exciting is if I was able to be starting to do that stuff with surface mount components, because that's when stuff starts getting really cheap. You start getting into surface mount stuff, and it's like, oh, hey, 401 JFET. I'm not sure it's really 401, but this particular kind of JFET that is the kind that you use for guitars and things because it's unusually high gain for what it does and distorts easy. And I can get these with leads for putting in perfboard or whatever, and it'll cost me $6, or it'll cost me $3, or it'll cost me $18, new old stock. And you can't get them anymore, but you can still get that exact part as surface mount for 0.25 cents. Not a cent, but like the surface mount stuff starts getting down into the fractional cents. Only thing about it is it's impossible to work with, but oh man, can you get the parts. And they're just making more and more like that all the time. The downside is they start getting tinier and tinier as they go. They go increasingly in the direction of working with computers and working with logic and robots. So humans aren't actually meant to use these. But they're being made. They're being made lots. And these are the same parts that one uses to build synthesizers out of. So that's food for thought. So that's pretty exciting. And again, VCV Rack is the digital open source software version of this. It feels to me kind of like the game version of it, except for not really, because a fair amount of the time, if you're doing your elaborate modular stuff, a lot of the things you're using are also digital in some form, or at least, like a lot of my voices are driven off of chord organs, and that is fairly low bit digital. So if you're in VCV Rack, you're probably able to get like 24-bit bus versus the stuff in the chord organ, which is a crude version of like 12-bit. But the way that it's done makes it a special kind. It's like old school digital and has its own kind of tone qualities to it. And then you're filtering it in the analog domain as well. All of this, it's all very interesting. It's also fairly exhausting keeping up with it all, but that's what makes it interesting. Hey, Gamma, maybe we will see you on Wednesday when we do the Minecraft thing, where we will be doing the the sort of reboot into more just building stuff world, but with the strange subterranean caves everywhere. That's planned. I'm already in the process of doing that. It's just it's going about as fast as everything else that I do, which is like, oh, I'm trying so much, it's so overwhelming. You know, like I'm meant to do this Minecraft thing and I'm meant to do this plugin thing, and then I'm getting distracted by doing lookup tables for, you know, and again, you can't really see that very well because I dialed the lookup tables to not be especially strong, but it's stuff that I'm doing from a video. And Gamma, you do not need to download anything for experimental geography. That is the plugin that runs on the server. Hey, Foco, I'm reasonably fine. I've been kind of fried in recent days, but there's enough of me left for a live stream, and I'll be plugging away at various things. The stuff that I do to kind of unwind often turns into things that I can give people, so that's cool. Sometimes that's extremely intense, or you only end up hearing about it years later, and that's fine too. Like, it had better be fine because there's no option. It's like, that's just how it's going to have to be. And yeah, David, I'm sure you caught what I was saying at the beginning of the stream. If not, I will repeat it, or I will repeat it for anybody who is tuned in as people come and go. Somebody started porting my stuff to VCV Rack. They're not public yet, but they showed me their work. And this time, they agreed, why yes, you can have it back. And so what I did was I grabbed a zip file, so now I have a bunch of Airwindows stuff in VCV Rack form. Not a bunch, like 6 different things. One of them is capacitor. In VCV Rack form, and I got to look at how they did it. And it includes all of these things, like all these other little files and ways things are done, and extra stuff. I'll be learning how he did it because I'm not going to want to try to reinvent the whole thing. But it will also mean I can come up with my own graphics and things. All I have to do is have a program that can generate SVG files, and it should be good. So that is much more realistic than it had been before. Because before, I did not have a working example. And it's still kind of conditional on I need to be able to get VCV Rack on this computer, have it be working, which is almost certain that it will be able to work, have me be able to learn how to use VCV Rack itself, just as a user, just as a musician. And then fire up a recent version of Xcode, do the VCV Rack plugin building thing that they've got, which basically involves learning how to build VCV Rack itself from source, and have that work successfully, which is not a given. It has not always happened for me. There have been times when I tried it and it did not work and I did not know how to make it work. But if I got all of that and it started working, and then this other fellow who seems to know how to do this, so he might even be willing to answer questions. I mean, he's all very much like, oh, can I do these plugins? Is that okay with you? I don't want to duplicate efforts or anything like. And I'm like, no. Your schooling or whatever is probably put you in a place where you're more easily able to do this kind of stuff. And if things go wrong, you can probably fix them, and I cannot. So, might be a really useful resource there. So essentially, we are on the track towards putting out VCV Rack plugins, either building them into the Airwindows collection or putting them out as separate releases. And more than that, like, if I get into it and start using it, it'll probably give me ideas for stuff I want to do. Like, there's signals. I was asking this guy specifically, like, oh, by the way, do you know how to do meters or blinking lights on VCV Rack? Because I'd be interested to know. And if he knows, he's presumably going to tell me if I'm nice to him. And I would bet he would, because it's like he's taking all of my work and doing his own stuff on it. And I told him, yes, duplicate the efforts, do your own thing, because we're going to try different plugins most likely. We're not necessarily going to do literally the same things. It's possible that I won't directly do any of the Airwindows plugins exactly as a VCVRAC thing. It's possible instead that I can get into that, or maybe talk with some of the people out of the the hell is the name of that thing? I've got one sitting right over here. I want to have more. Music Thing Modular has a kit for it. Axolotl. Some of the people from the Axolotl forum are really good at making fancy oscillators. It's like, I don't understand what they're doing, but I'm all about it, because there was a time in the Axolotl world where I looked into what was going on there, because Axolotl, basically, it's this little hardware synth that you get to play with. Music Thing has a thing where it lets you add some buttons, and it lets you add a couple of those little joysticks on top. I don't think they add much or anything in the way of lots of jacks and things, so integrating it with another system is not that great. But the Axolotl can be used, I just whacked my microphone, sorry about that. The Axolotl can be used as a synthesizer, and you get this sort of node-based, like dragging stuff around to construct in their little program the guts of how the synth works, and then you upload it to the Axolotl, and the Axolotl does the thing and makes the sound. So it's adaptable. They're the coolest things ever. I'm thinking there's a new version that's being developed that I hope will be more Eurorack compatible, and I'm very excited about that. But currently, I have tried out a bunch of things when fooling with Axolotl, like what are all these different little modules that are built into it? They look like, something off of an architect designer thing or circuit design thing. Like you drag in a little triangle with some dots on it, and then drag things to the dots on the triangle, and it does the thing, or a little box or whatever. But like I said, there are people working in there who seem to know a lot about oscillators. And so they're doing things like, this is the special band limited alias reducing oscillator here, what do you think? And they're making boxes that go beep. They're not doing anything necessarily all that spectacular as far as musicality is concerned, but they know some of the secrets. They know some of the tricks. The stuff that they do sounds like frickin' Deadmau5. It sounds like Serum, because they're running on a fairly basic little platform, but they're using the correct algorithms for really efficiently generating things like sawtooths or squares or something like that are not aliasing, that are not producing the digital problems that we expect. And they don't have it all because they're not using my dithering to floating point or anything like that. But they've got stuff I don't have. And they're all part of this hacker community. So it all kind of starts to come together. It all kind of starts to come together in interesting ways. Because it's like, yeah, VCVRAC, very cool. It's a big elaborate program. It's, if I can learn to do it, I can start to bring some of my sounds into it. Axolotl, that's not a program so much as it is a little hardware thing. But the programmer that helps you make patches for the hardware thing involves making code in like assembly language practically. And I think actually it might be C, but some of the people doing that seem to know a lot about amazing oscillators, which are the kinds of things that you could build in VCVRAC, which is the program that can be downloaded for free rather than Axolotl, which you have to buy a $70 little hardware piece. This could all get kind of exciting. And if I go completely stir crazy from total seclusion, and the total seclusion thing is interesting for me. I probably can talk about that for a while as well. How's everybody handling coronavirus isolation? See, we've got the same people as ever, so it's like there's no new people, but how are you folks handling that stuff? Also, Software has a quick question, which is, why does the Weiss compressor sound better? Maybe they're just doing it well. Maybe they have a good algorithm. I'm not really quite sure how they could be. Maybe you like oversampling and they're doing oversampling. Weiss as a company, those folks know what they're doing. They also tend to be really expensive, but they don't know what they're doing, so it would be a matter of what sounds better to you at heavy compression rates, because there's many different ways of doing that. Excuse me. I'm going to sleep after this. I am definitely rather tired. So David, the advantage of having Airwindows stuff built into VCV Rack over using VCV host is that VCV Rack works in a sample-by-sample basis. It's not using buffers, because it can't. Because you cannot construct a modular synthesizer using some of the things that we do in modular synthesizers by processing things in buffers. You must be able to access each of the individual things. Whereas if I'm building plugins directly for VCV Rack, it'll be designed from the very start to optimize for that condition. And hopefully I can do stuff that's CPU efficient so that people can have more interesting and elaborate stuff, as well as things like some plugins that I'm meaning to release for regular plugins, like tone generators. I have a need for making a sine generator at 997 Hertz that beats the Logic tone generator, because it's like I can make a sine generator that's generating in long double and dithering to the floating point bus. I can make a better sine generator than Apple's, because they're not using this stuff. So it's a matter of like doing that. And if you're doing things one sample at a time, like one does in VCV Rack, then that also changes how you approach making the algorithm. There's things to do when you know you're processing in buffers. Everything changes around a little bit. You're making some of your decisions perhaps slightly differently, because what you're dealing with is going to be like you can catch stuff differently, you can arrange it differently. If you're definitely only going to be handling one sample at a time, because everybody has to, all your little modules have to handle one sample at a time so that they can like frequency modulate each other or whatever. I do not, well, if the problem there is a VCV host that's using existing plugins pretty much has to use buffers of some kind, because plugins are not designed to run sample by sample. I would hesitate to say it was impossible, but the problem is if you're running a normal plugin and defining its buffer as like 1 so that it is operating sample by sample, I think a lot of stuff built into that plugin is going to become incredibly high overhead. Like, go ahead, try and make your block size in your DAW one sample, see how far you get. It'll fall over and scream and die. And yeah, I'm assuming what Ben is saying as far as look at block size in the VCV host, yeah, that's because it's hosting plugins. Plugins are designed to do that. VCV Rack modules, and the whole reason why it's challenging to the computer and why I was not finding that I could do non-trivial things with it, because I couldn't compute fast enough. I like ran out of steam fairly quickly, is for that reason. plugins get to process things in blocks. A real modular synthesizer that's like a live organism can't. It has to process everything pretty much at the sample rate. So it is just grinding a lot more in a way that's extremely wasteful for a DAW, but for a modular synthesizer, that's just naturally how it is. Like, that's how you get some of your sounds. If you're doing things like modulating other sounds with other sounds, you quickly get beyond what you can do with buffer sizes, because everything's got to modulate everything really fast. Like, the nice thing about a analog modular is you can do radio frequencies quite happily, and the weirdness you can get into is on an expanded level. Like, I'm a big fan of the Make Noise O-Coast for a variety of reasons, and one of them is that it's got its little signal generators and things going on, and various kinds of processing and wave folding. But the high end on this, like the high frequencies, are just ravishing. It's amazing what that can do tonally. And part of that is because that Make Noise stuff is really capable of handling a wide range of audio way beyond what the sampling rate is going to give you in the box. And since it's a modular synthesizer, stuff can interfere with each other at any frequencies, including subsonic or radio frequencies or whatever else. And that's part of where you get some of your sounds. Certainly that's what I'm doing with some of my stuff. But VCV Rack lacking its buffers and processing on a sample by sample thing, you can do a lot of stuff that's like it. It's just when you drive it too far, or you start having stuff get really chaotic, because here's another example of the buffer versus non-buffer thing. One of the things I like doing, and you can actually see it on there, the bright colored aluminum line down the center there, those are all like two banks of synth stuff. Those are sine wave generators. And what I like doing with those is, in fact, I had 3 of them set up at one point, is feeding them into each other, because those sine wave generators have a sine output and a cosine output. It's called a quadrature, meaning that you can get different variations on the phase of the waveform. And what it works like, however, is here's a sine wave output and here's another sine wave output that is slightly different phase, but it's exactly the same. Like, if you just listen to it, they're both sines. Meaning you have a spare sine wave. Meaning you can send the spare sine wave into the frequency modulation of the other oscillator, oh hey, vibrato, and then send the spare sine wave of the one that you just put stuff in into your first one. You're cross-modulating. And when you're cross-modulating, you get into glorious craziness. And this is something that will work with VCV Rack to an extent, but it will not work with DAWs and things that process in buffers. Because what's happening is, like, your one is frequency modulating the other, which is frequency modulating the first back, and so on, in a loop. And as you increase it, you start getting literal chaos out of the output. It stops becoming predictable in any way. And as a waveform, that sounds like a weird, shrieky noise, or there's a whole variety of different noises you can make out of chaotic waveforms. And yes, it would mean that I would have to recode plugins to work without buffers. It would absolutely mean exactly that. Which is one of the reasons why I'm not likely to just mindlessly port all of the plugins to VCV Rack. If I can start working in that, I'm going to start being immediately interested in what do I need to make for this platform. This is not a DAW. This is a modular synthesizer. I'm all about modular synthesizers. What do I need in this platform that I could do my thing with it? Which is not necessarily, I mean, it's some of the same things that I do in a DAW. Like, I would very quickly be doing a line mixer And it's like, okay, this is the Airwindows line mixer. This is CV controllable, and here is a bunch of inputs, and they're all running through console. That'd be one of the first things I would do, because it's so useful, and it's one of the first things I needed when I started fooling with it and going like, oh, and none of the mixers are free, and other people's mixers, yeah, but this is still the digital mixer. So great, everything that I do in this platform, and I can get raw waveforms that sound pretty good out of it, but everything starts to have to be using somebody's DAW digital mixer, and I'm just not inspired by that. So I would be pretty quickly getting into some of those utility things, but it'd also be getting into like, what am I trying to make happen? David, I've been trying to lose patrons for the last month. It doesn't apparently work. I've been telling people, like, save yourselves, things are getting really rough. Go and rescue yourself, and instead people just throw more money. It's like the opposite effect. So I've kind of stopped doing it. Also, I got scolded for, like, stop telling people not to help you. We're helping you because we like you. And I'm like, oh, okay. So yeah, I have no fear if I find VCV Rack inspiring to start doing stuff for that and calling that as a weekly plugin thing, because I could. It would certainly count. It would even have GUIs, because you can't do generic plugins for VCV Rack. It's not being made available. You must come up with some form of GUI because it's not built to work any other way. Yeah, no, I mean, this is why we're at an hour 40. We are now at an hour 40 because things got so much better that it's paying for 40 minutes, an hour and 40 minutes of streaming rather than 139 or 138. Doesn't seem like very much, but I would be able to nap sooner if I had scared away patrons. Boo! I'd be scary away. Then I can go and grab a nap earlier. But no, that's just something that I decided to do, and I'm honoring it. Honestly, it could get pretty hilarious to the point where I'd have to figure something out. I bet if it went long enough, people would let me take bathroom breaks and stuff, presumably. But yeah, I mean, it could be like, okay, Chris, now you have to do 4-hour streams because we're giving you $4,000 a month. There you go. And I would find it difficult to argue. It'd be like, I guess that's just how it's going to be now. But we ain't anywhere near that, even though it's going in that direction. Another good question. Is there any audio quality benefit to working sample by sample? Nope. There is no audio quality benefit to that. It is just a functional quality for if you're doing cross modulation or something, or constructing waveforms by manipulating waveforms against other waveforms. Because that's the whole way this works. It's like, if you're doing modular synthesis, it's really not about, here's my sound, and here's my mixing board, and here's my EQ and stuff. It's more like, okay, here's an oscillator. Here's a voltage-controlled amplifier. This can make the oscillator be louder or quieter. Here is another oscillator. It has a frequency modulation input. I could fit either like another oscillator that's going slowly, or even one of the audio rates ones, into this other oscillator, and now it's doing an FM synth sound, because that's literally what that is. Or here is a oscillator, here is the VCA, this is my envelope. Oh, but since this is a modular, I'm going to feed another audio rate oscillator into the trigger for the pluck noise that I'm making. And I've done this repeatedly on the real modular, namely some kind of square wave, and we'll talk about that, David. I have a scolding. some kind of square wave that is re-triggering a whole other sample or something like that. And there's lots of stuff you can do, because in a modular synthesizer, there's no such thing as, note or envelope. It's just a bunch of waveforms and voltages, and you can patch them into whatever you want. So David, here's the conversation we're going to have about this. You guys went off on me on the Wednesday stream. You were drunk. You were kind of spoiling my day. And I'm not sure, you don't necessarily have the right to be constructively critical, because I'm not you, and I'm not necessarily going to do the things that you need. You need many things from me. You want me to play on this live jam thing. I think that's a great idea, but I never do that with anybody. And that's why I'm not doing it with you, is because I never do it with anybody. I don't remember what Ahmed was. I think Ahmed was maybe. Here's the thing. If Ahmed was complaining about me talking about my modular stuff because he can't have it, that's part of why I put out the snare samples that I just did. That's part of why I did that. I mean, to get all up in my grill about not helping people who need free stuff is pretty laughable, and you have to give me the right to come back at you and be like, no, I'm mad at you because you're swearing at me or getting in my face or stuff, and I'm already doing stuff for you, and I'm not having, it's constructive criticism is earned. It doesn't just come from nowhere. And everybody has something that they would like to happen, which is why it's good to help people have the tools to make the things that they want. I talked to the guy from Blue Lantern. I sent him email. I never heard back. There are a number of people I'd like to talk to Tom Whitwell and be like, oh, I love these things that you're making. How can I do more of that? He's not necessarily going to talk to me. He likes the coding stuff that I did for him, for his platform. But that doesn't mean that he ever wants to hear from me as a person or any of that. It's there's always going to be failure to communicate. That is always going to be a thing. And how gracefully we handle that is basically what civilization looks like. And I get snippy when civilization starts to break down. And it's well, if I hit you harder, will you do the thing that I want? And it's no, I won't. Let's bounce around and answer other questions as well, rather than just going into dark places. Zafor is I wish every producer and mixer could try analog compression and distortion at least once. That I'd like to make the ability for people to build stuff on their own, but that's still going to be way more inaccessible for most people. So most people can't. It's just the bottom line is people generally can't do some of these things that I enjoy a lot. And I would like to further that being possible, but there's still going to be a lot more people that can download programs and work on virtual stuff, and there's no changing that. Infinity is asking if digital audio is truncated because of samples. Is there a way to find an average? Yeah, use higher sample rates. And that's actually another program idea that I have in mind for a plugin. I think it's probably worth putting together a plugin, maybe even, I don't think I ever put together my distortions plugin, which is going to be switching among a whole bunch of different options there. But one thing that might be good is a plugin that's built by default to take on higher sample rates and automatically restrict stuff into the audible range. So if you're running at 96K, it's going to automatically average the input and the output a certain amount. And if you're running at 192K, it's going to average the input and the output even more. And as a result, with a bit of luck, there'll be a warmer sound to it and it will be more aliasing resistant, which does not mean it'll successfully avoid aliasing. That's going to be one of the problems with the VCV rack stuff, is because the idea of how that works is you pretty much can't get around getting a bunch of aliasing out of all the VCV rack stuff. It's all going to alias like crazy in very complicated ways. But to not do that would be so CPU intense that it's like, rather than worry about this, let's just take it somewhere else. Rather than worry about how much aliasing all this craziness is doing in the VCV rack, let's just come up with things to do that either use that on purpose or like have handy ways of filtering stuff out. And rather than, not everything has to become made like analog gear. You can have stuff that has the aliasing and has those digital sounds as long as it's working in some acceptable way. That's like what I was talking about with the guitar amp modeling stuff. I was thinking in terms of Kemper and stuff, and that's what was trying to come into my brain. You can do stuff like that. For instance, Kemper is a good example of processing real heavily and doing it all super right to make it sound kind of analog and squishy and organic sounding. But you can also do what Meshuggah was doing in, I think, the Chaosphere album and some of those other albums around then, when they were doing you guys, I'm glad that I can still laugh at it some of the time. I have a harder time laughing at David, but that's teasing him. Somebody should show me a VCV rack thing that uses... Actually, why should VCV rack ever use MIDI? MIDI is a bad protocol. I'm not interested. But Chaosphere was using guitar tones in the category of like math metal or djent that are not analog-y guitar tones. Instead, they are brutally bright, gritty, aliasing, opaque tones with a lot of character, a lot of anger and edge and stuff. But the way that... I get sick of this very quickly. The way that the sound interacts with the djent musical style, it's basically a percussion implement, and it's doing the same thing that hip-hop performers, producers use with low-bit sampling themselves. Is you're taking the thing away from being a really textural thing and you're changing the texture strikingly. You're changing the way that it hits, the way that it feels. And that makes it be something else. So you don't have to make everything be analog. You don't have to make everything be this or that or the other thing. What you do is try to get the most out of whatever thing it is that you're using. And with VCV, again, that could very well be picking stuff to do. Like, there's plenty of room within the sampling rate to do all kinds of really cool low frequency stuff in VCV rack with a lot of class. Not difficult. In fact, if this fellow starts releasing his thing, which I hope will be soon so I can tell people about it and encourage him. I was telling him, Guy, don't worry about duplicating my efforts. That's why it's MIT license. If you start doing this and you find that you can do it really well and you're able to do it really fast, you could start your own Patreon and be like, hi, I'm the guy that's porting all the Airwindows stuff to VCV rack with its permission. Here, support me. And then if people wanted him to do that faster, they could give him money to do it. I'm still making other plugins. I can't drop everything and port everything to VCV rack. It's too big of a task. But another person could. So it's like, we can, and if that guy does his thing and it comes out, you almost immediately will have capacitor. I saw his code. He had taken the, possibly because he's a PC user, if he was going for this, he could have done it using the AU. He took one of the VST plugins and basically commented out all of the right channel stuff, because what he was doing, it was a one-channel version of capacitor. And I looked at it and I was like, yep, that's the code. And I more or less see how he's put everything together. I'll be able to work with this. So if you are doing that, you should maybe try using the AU code instead, because it might not be, the familiar VCV format, but, I should tell him to do ULAW. That would be actually a really good idea. In a modular context, that could be very handy. But there's the thing, is other people get to do this as well. That's why it's open source. It's open source because I need to keep doing many things. I can't just drop it all and be like, now I'm going to port to this particular format that I don't understand. Instead, the code becomes like a library of stuff that you could do, and it's a library that I can draw on as well. So my hope is that when I start putting out VCV Rack plugins, which seems fairly likely, seeing as I have working code and it's fairly likely I can get all that working, it's fairly likely that there will be no exact duplications between the AU/VST plugins and the VCV Rack ones. And the VCV Rack ones will also be open source, but there will be no literal duplication between the two things. Because I honestly feel like if I started working in that, I'd start wanting stuff. I'd start wanting to do stuff. I would start wanting to make stuff. And it wouldn't necessarily be an exact clone of anything that I had in plugins. Like some of the plugins that I have, I don't necessarily want anymore. Like, I don't feel like doing more pocket verbs because it's such a big pile of code. I'd rather it be in more of a modular form. Well, VCV Rack is literally a modular form. So, we'll see. We'll see. Which brings us to like just about 12:30. So I got about 10 minutes and then I get to go and take a nap. My throat's starting to hurt. I think we stopped having a lot of questions, although Styrian did have a question. You see, I own the fact that questions can get by me in a chat. And that's always going to happen because what's going on inside my head is always more distracting than what people are talking about. But I see a question from Styrian, who may or may not still be here, about recommendations for a compressor for video. And my answer is, I honestly don't know. A sketch show. I think people might be talking about they were talking about it in the comments earlier. I think somebody recommended Curve and Recurve. That's not a bad idea. Stuff like Surge, these are not necessarily the correct answer. You got to try stuff and see what works for you. Like I've got Logical, which is a plugin that acts a lot like a normal compressor in many ways. That is a pretty reasonable way of going about things too. But when I have tried to compress things like my feed for this stream, I've generally done something like thrown Curve on it and called it a day. I didn't want anything particularly aggressive, but I wanted a little bit of evening going on. So I think we have similar answers there, in that I think that voice and stuff like that, yeah, something like Curve or Recurve. Recurve is just boosted curve. It's a little bit more complicated, but not all that much. And Infinity has another thought, which is, I don't know. I don't know if that's necessarily so, Infinity. I guess you could choose. No, I really don't know, because it's like if you're frequency modulating stuff, how do you know that doing lots more of it or making it really complicated isn't going to produce some intermodulation distortion or some weird artifacts? I don't think it's anything like alias proof, nor do I think that classic FM synths sound free of aliasing. Indeed, when they start getting really bright, you start getting a really, like, some of the best FM synth sounds, like some of the best crazy Yamaha sounds, are really brutal, because what aliasing sounds like in a FM synth is wildly different than what you expect out of like the Shannon sampling theorem. So you don't necessarily want to band limit it. What you might want to do is go like, okay, as we keep turning up this higher frequency harmonic, it starts going crazy bonkers nutso, and you start getting this really noisy white sounding just clash, and that's part of the sound of my instrument now. I'm just going for a more aggressive tone, and I get one of those really gritty, aggressive FM things going on, and that you wouldn't necessarily want to band limit it, because it's part of what lets you get crazier sounds. And it could be controlled fairly gracefully by just putting an envelope on it, and like if you have something that goes crazy when you push it beyond a certain point, you can have it fade back off of that certain point. And yeah, especially if we're talking about FM synth in a sort of loop formation, making a chaotic oscillator, it's definitely not going to be aliasing proof. And that means it'll have a very different sound from building a chaotic oscillator off of analog waveforms, which I can also do, because the dope for analog, the dope for sine wave generators that I've got, the ones that are like aluminum colored, those are analog. They're sine wave generators, they're quadrature, meaning that they give you phase stuff, but they're analog generators, so you can dial them up to supersonic frequencies and have them clash and modulate each other and get lots of weird sounds. But then if you were doing the same thing in a digital synthesizer like VCV Rack, you'd get a completely different sound that might be really cool. Or might not, who knows. It's like one of the things I'm likely to try earliest is not dissimilar to my hi-hat generator, but not. Because that would be a really good thing to bring. I don't even remember what I called it now. But I generated a hi-hat that runs off of residue sequences, and that is not the way that I do hi-hats on that system, because on the actual modular system, half the time I'm doing hi-hats using more Blue Lantern stuff, and I know exactly how that works. It is 3 square waves with logic functions between them, and that would be trivial to do in VCV Rack. Electro hat, thank you. So I could do an entirely separate hat that is this widely accepted technique. It's not like it's unique to Blue Lantern. He's just got a variation on that stuff that I like, and they're cheaper. But you don't even have to have a single module doing it. You could do that just off of VCV Rack itself. All you need is logic modules and square wave modules, and you're golden. You got it. It is 2 square waves with like an exclusive OR or something, and then the output of that to another square wave with another exclusive OR, and you wind up getting one of those really old school digital hat sounds. The way he's got it set up is basically just as a straight oscillator, but there's also a imperfect, and unfortunately it's not all that great, but it's very raw VCA built into it. And if you tweak that, you can get envelopes out of it. Although unfortunately it doesn't actually cut out the noise at the oscillator perfectly when it shuts off, which is unfortunately. If you did that to 32-bit, why doesn't the noise build up? Well, it depends. Like if you had a dithering to 32-bit at a very low level, and then you transformed that in some way, offset it to a higher amplitude level, the space between I hesitate to say stair steps, but I don't know how to, is automatically louder, swamping whatever you had before. Also, the levels of the noise are so completely quiet, but that is a practical reason why noise generated at one level doesn't necessarily translate to like being slightly offset and coming in at a different level in the 32-bit word. So under those circumstances, it might not build up at all. Hey, we're moving along really good. Last questions? The last 3 minutes or so. I'm not going to be real strict about it. I think the main information here today was that somebody is helping me do VCV rack stuff, meaning that in the next week or so I need to start fooling with that, which I believe I can do. I have to set aside time to think about it, because when I get caught up in stuff, or when I get caught up in current events, or, one day over the last week I got caught up in somebody that I knew personally who was getting into this very excruciatingly nerdy argument about why all of this is bullshit and people should just go out and do commerce. And I got so mad. I got so mad at the guy. He will never be my friend again because I learned a little too much about him under those circumstances. But stuff like that gets in the way of me being able to do my work. I get too caught up in it and too mad, and I can't think about the stuff that I'm supposed to think about. So it takes me time to unclench and switch away from some of those things enough to be able to work on this stuff that actually matters from me. Because me getting mad at somebody for talking nonsense doesn't matter as much from me. It would matter more from a policeman who would be like, no, shut up, go inside. Go inside, wash your hands, shut up. But from me, it doesn't mean anything because they don't need to listen to me on that subject. Oh yeah, it's been challenging. A lot of stuff has been going on. And again, I am pleased that I was able to put Outsider, even though I couldn't demonstrate it. Probably you're going to start seeing Logic next, because at least I know that. I think I can find my way around it in such a way that it's not going to break on me. And I'm pleased that I was able to release the new snares, because I needed to make those for me. I needed snares that were a little more compressed, a little bigger and more spectacular, rather than the very clean, dry ones that I had before, which were pretty much just straight up a sample and a relatively high resolution sample all the same. But they did not have the distortion and compression stuff that one normally uses to make drums be big and spectacular sounding. So I'm happy I put that out. I hope people find those things useful. There will be more where that came from. And it's just a matter now of getting through the next week without losing my mind too much or getting sick again or something. And seeing what comes out of the process. Because my process is very derailed in a bunch of different directions. And it'll always produce stuff. It'll always produce results. But which specific results? That can be a little bit stranger. And we will see. We will see how all of that stuff goes. It was especially frustrating doing an entire video that wound up being broken and demoing the snares so that you could actually hear them, turning them up on the desk, and realizing, oh hey, I can't get over to the synthesizer right now to change the sound, and my rig is so screwed up that I can't hear what it's doing. So I couldn't hear which snare I was showing. I just remembered that it was one that was really boring, and I couldn't reach the knob to change it. And if I did change it, I didn't know what I was changing it to. Oh, that was a mess. But on that note, I'm going to switch back over to OBS and bid you guys adieu and go and rest. You do likewise if you need to. And oh, just for fun, this is what I was getting the entire time. It was a whole double echo thing because my setup was all borked and working wrong. And that was too ridiculous. I was listening to the 20 minutes that I did going, oh no. Whatever. Talk to y'all later. Bye-bye.